Welcome back, everyone, to episode 4 of the Hurt to Healing podcast with Yola and Anthony. We're switching it up today. We didn't get to do a formal startup to the episode, so we're going to start a little before and talk here. Today we interviewed Dr. Ayanna Maddox at the University of Michigan. She is a former professor here at UConn, and she's very well studied in philosophy, and I believe it was women and gender studies. We had a great conversation. We covered a lot of topics. You can tell she's very knowledgeable, and she was very willing to share some personal things, share some professional stories, and we hope you really enjoy. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Yola?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for coming back and listening. And I really wanted to thank Dr. Ayana. She's been such a great influence in the work that I've done and introducing me to um, academia and the aspect of gender-based violence. Currently, she doesn't work at UConn anymore. She holds a senior coordinator position at Girls for Gender Equity. And as you will learn later in the episode, we'll see how that has influenced her career and her commitment to gender-based violence.
Yeah, so again, it was a great conversation. Thank you for coming back, and we hope you enjoy.
And I do that with our Senior Director of Evaluation. And we're hoping to launch some new youth participatory action research projects where young people get to decide the research questions that are asked about their lives.
Thank you for sharing all of that and
Yeah.
being so open about your experiences professionally and personally, especially relating to gender-based violence. And I think something that was coming up for me when you were talking, and Anthony and I were actually having this conversation last night. We were talking about this like decriminalization of gender-based violence or violence, and there is I learned in one of my classes yesterday in my torture class that there is a group of feminists that are kind of advocating for this decriminalization of violence. So then the focus would be more so on what each survivor wants. And I know that in our class, which was my favorite class at UConn, we talked a lot about that, about how essentially when you are criminalizing violence to a certain extent, or when you're criminalizing it in general, it further serves to victimize and further violate the rights of the people that are getting criminalized in the first place. So then the prison system in itself, or the criminalization aspect of it in itself, is or can be a form of gender-based violence as well.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about that and the experiences or like opinions that you have on that?
Sure. Yeah, I have lots to say about that. I mean, I think first and foremost, the criminal justice system in the US institutionalizes gender-based violence, right? For folks who are justice involved, people are facing regular strip searches, cavity searches, gender checks, which include checks of people's genitalia. And it's not like you get to consent, right? And that's legal, but that's legal. That's considered good practice for the safety of um, staff, correction officers, and everyone involved in detentions, jails, and prisons. Unfortunately, we know, especially in pop culture, people make a lot of really awful rape jokes about what happens in jails and prisons based on the reality that a lot of people are facing sexual violence when they're incarcerated, right? Um, Sometimes by other people who are incarcerated, a lot of times by correctional officers that are involved in overseeing folks who are locked up. Um, Even as people who visit jails and prisons, many people face strip searches. And in order to see your loved one, you kind of have to go through it, right? So again, these are legal institutionalized forms of non-consensual, intimate touching and searching, right? That in any other space, we would go, that's not okay. You don't get to just do that. So I think that's like first and foremost, is like the experiences that people are actually having on the inside, and even those who attempt to even just stay connected with people who have been pushed outside of mainstream society, right, by being incarcerated. The second thing is, yes, unfortunately, we've seen statistically that with the rise of mass incarceration, as well as the rise of what we would call carceral feminism, so feminists who push for more police-based solutions to gender-based violence, so asking for more mandatory sentencing, asking for stronger, stricter punishments, a whole host of things that come with that, that disproportionately people of color have actually been incarcerated. So we are seeing a boom, right, of Black men and Indigenous and Latino men being incarcerated under these mandatory sentencing laws. And at the same time, we see from a gender-based lens, many women, girls, and gender-expansive youth and adults are more likely to be charged with prostitution, trafficking, right? Like they actually end up getting charged as if they're co-conspirators instead of survivors of violence themselves when the state makes contact with survivors. So instead of being sort of connected to resources that would lead you to, maybe mental health professionals, or maybe you need housing services or other things that survivors frequently need, they're being incarcerated themselves, right? And I mentioned, my research is about criminalized survivors, many of whom were surviving for a long time their abusers, and then finally struck back. And again, instead of being understood as somebody who had been surviving violence and doing the absolute best that they could, they're seen as premeditated murderers, right? Like when we look at the actual charges, they're not treated as people in need of care, but instead the state looks to prosecute them. District attorneys will, level charges, and then a whole campaign has to happen, right? To free Centoya Brown, to free Crystal Kreiser, to make it the case that folks are actually even taken seriously as the survivors they actually are, trying to navigate ongoing violence. So there's so much to be said, honestly, about the ways in which the state is playing a really, really harmful role in not only legalizing sexual violence, but also incarcerating and harming those who have already experienced sexual violence. And then the last thing I'll say on this is just like, I believe in abolition feminism. I would probably say that I fall within that group. And there's diversity amongst us, right? So it is not the case that I think that we have to go from one extreme to the other in the sense that like, we should just not involve the state at all. I think that survivors make really complicated decisions and calculated risk about when to engage the state and when not to. Because sometimes it is beneficial for a survivor to get a temporary restraining order, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of cons to that, because then you're releasing your address to that person who could then use that. Like, there's a lot that comes with that. It's not a perfect solution, but sometimes that's what somebody needs in order to have that stepping stone to a future plan to get away from the community they need to get away from, or to stay where they need to stay. So I'm not one of those people that says any engagement with the state means that you're in love with the cops, or like you believe in carceral movements. I think it's just far more complicated than that, and I don't think it's fair for us to hold survivors to unfair standards, where we expect survivors to not engage with the state, not engage with police, not engage with probation officers and other attorneys and cops, when we don't have good solutions to actually hold survivors right now, right? Like, unfortunately, there are a lot of people who experience crisis right now, and we don't have good solutions to tell people where to go other than facilities that are connected to federal funds, which means connection to the justice system. So I also want to put that out there, where it's like we are building towards a future we want to see where we can rely on community, but we're not there yet to really say, don't engage the state. We have to build out more infrastructure and services for survivors outside of the carceral system.
Mhm.
I think that that's a great point, and I'm curious. And I think on this podcast we do a lot of talking about what things could look like or the ideal. And that's something that I think Yola and I have gotten from the Women's Center. One of our supervisors was super into, like, let's talk about the ideal. So I would like you to talk a little bit more about, I agree. I don't think that we have the right systems in place for victims to fully be safe or go to the state. Do you have an ideal of what that looks like? How do we build community from here? Does it start with things like Girls for Gender Equity? Does it start with campuses? Like where does that start? That community building?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. I really want to hear what you all think too about all of this. 'Cause I'll just be on here spitting. And I really do want to hear what y'all think. Um, but like I think one of the wonderful things is there's so many people who have taken on this question and are already doing the work. So like Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective has a ton of resources about some of the ways that we can do this. So for instance, they have a resource called pod mapping where you can actually sit down and just think through like who's in a survivor's ecosystem, who could you actually call and do some what we would call, typically like safety planning beforehand. So before crisis happens, or even, after, you can think through it through the pod mapping as well. But to really think about who can you actually call? If you're not going to call the police, who can you call sincerely? And do you know what they can offer you, right? And so an example would be, for instance, maybe you have a friend with a car and you know that that's the person you can call for rides. Maybe you have another friend that doesn't have a license yet. That's real. I got mine later in life too. But they're maybe a really good listener, right? And so you just need someone to vent to and start really getting a sense of who can you call, how can they show up for you in community, and how are you showing up for them? So starting to get a sense of who you're in community with, and what we can offer each other through what's called pod mapping is one way that people have thought about this. Interrupting Criminalization is another organization that has thought through this. Survived and Punished is another organization that one chapter is based in New York, another is based in California. They've been thinking through a lot of this work, especially supporting criminalized survivors. And to kind of fast forward, there's like so many examples of people who are really trying to figure this out right now. But I think Girls for Gender Equity absolutely is another example that does a couple of different things. So like we do a lot of wraparound support for young people. And so we have a number of social workers that work at GGE who work directly with young people to ensure that we're showing up for them, offering references to other organizations as needed to make sure that people are getting their needs met. We also do a lot of political education internally. We offer safe spaces for young people to share their stories and share their voices, and then decide if they want to be engaged in different political campaigns related to their experiences. So some young people have gotten involved in what's called Schools Girls Deserves, which is a campaign that we've run historically as an organization, really fighting for police-free schools. So what does it look like to meaningfully create safe spaces within schools that are accountable to young people based on the counselors, teachers, administrators who can be, active bystanders and intervene in violence without safety or school resource officers. So that's a couple of just like ideas of things that we can do like right now, from just thinking about who's in your ecosystem. Maybe it's people that live in your dorm or your building or on your street, to being able to have more mental health and behavioral support, access and references to direct service organizations that might be able to support with housing support, finding employment, because when you have like money and housing and places to go, you're able to escape violence differently, right? Than when you don't. All the way to what are some of the political campaigns that we want to win to decrease contact with those who perpetuate harm and violence.
Yeah, I think you brought up this great point. Like, I actually really like the idea of the mapping. I think I unconsciously have been doing that, and I didn't know it was a real thing. So it's good to be able to kind of visualize that and know that, just on the right path here. But I think that's a great idea because I think it really demonstrates and puts this like role modeling of community, that it's like even if you don't have a specific guidance of exactly what to do, it's like different things work for different people. So I think it makes it very survivor centric, where you're actually the main person that gets to decide what you're putting in your map, and you're like getting to utilize whoever you're putting in your map, and it relies on things that you trust, decisions that you've made, and the autonomy and relationships that you've built. And I think that's a very great reminder, especially when you are like in the survivor role, or if there's an instance where things are coming up again or where you've been re-traumatized. I think it's really good to then have that map and ability to just like rely back on it, because it's a reminder of all of these things that are still within you and a part of you, such as your autonomy, even if that feels really hard to access at that point. And then the next thing that I really like, because you asked earlier that you'd want to hear like where we think we should get started, and I actually realized this when I was writing my thesis, but someone from the people that I had interviewed, they had mentioned, I'm a huge proponent of like education, knowledge. Like, I think a big component of getting to understand gender-based violence and like accessing these resources has to start from education, because if you're not even understanding it as such to begin with, you're not going to have the ability or accessibility to access the resources or access the support that you might need, which is very common, and it happens at its own time, like no shaming on that. But what someone brought up when I interviewed them was this new production that they're doing, like this book production in Albania that is called The Happiness Balloon. And it was a way to demonstrate to kids from the ages of 4 to 8 years old of how domestic violence can happen and what are the feelings that can come up with it, which I was extremely shocked, because I had wished when I grew up in Albania that I had something like that. And I went and I was reading it, and the professors get given this book that has the happiness balloon story, but also has like steps of how they can facilitate reading the story or how the students might respond to it, depending on the age that they're at and what they're conceptualizing at the time. And then also I like read the production where it was just the story. And then in the just the story aspect, there was like all these like sticky like figure drawings, like they were super simple. And the story went something along the lines of the child was sleeping and they heard parents yelling, and then they heard something break or whatever, and then the next morning they had woken up to see things like scattered around the house, and they knew that something had been going on, and they had heard their father like calling names to their mother, and just the mother being very upset and crying, just like very specific but also kind of generalized ways of gender-based violence and how those can show up in the private sphere, I guess. So then they, with the happiness balloon, what they did was it said how the child went to school the next day, and the teacher had noticed that the child was like a little bit off, even though they still were participating in everything. And then and then when the teacher had asked, they had moved it from the perspective of the child that was like, oh, the teacher never laughs at me, and she usually cares about how my day is going. So I'm going to tell her this because I don't think she's going to be upset with me or get angry with me or just make fun of me, which I thought it was so important, because for a child that's reading that and they might have those same fears, it's like it kind of breaks that barrier. And then essentially the teacher had said, okay, well, what are you feeling? And then the child would go along and say, well, I don't know, like I have all these like feelings. And the teacher had offered this metaphor of a balloon, how the more pressure, which is like the feelings, the more pressure you add to the balloon, eventually it's going to like explode. And if you keep like relying on that pressure and just keep putting it without like releasing it somewhere, it's going to explode. So then it was talking about, well, what are some things that help you release that pressure, even not in just in this instance? And the child had talked about how they feel like this happiness balloon when they're just riding their bike. And then the teacher was like, okay, that's a great way to release pressure. And then it was like, oh, but I also feel it when I do this other thing. So then it was powerful because you're labeling things that help you without even realizing it, that, oh, this is what I'm actually doing. And then at the end of it, the child had said that, I felt so great about talking with my teacher, because now I know that I can't wait to go home and ride my bike. But it was like, I also understand that my parents, they haven't been releasing the pressure from their own balloons, so then it's been exploding and spilling over into like the other people. And while that's not my fault or my responsibility, I know that this is not like personal to me. This is just like the work they haven't done, which I read that and was like, to have that kind of knowledge or ability, or just something there to conceptualize or give you a new framework of thinking, that's something I didn't get access to until much later on, probably until college, that I was really able to like understand or go back and challenge those internalized ways of, okay, maybe this was my fault, or just kind of blaming myself, or being very confused and just feeling unsafe. And then I thought that it was a great example of what should be kind of incorporated really everywhere. And we talk about it so much about how, yeah, children are such a big component of understanding and changing this. And then people are like, well, teaching children about consent at an early age, like that's just weird, da da da. But then this is such a simple way that you can do things like that without necessarily making children grow up ahead of time. But it's like the situation and circumstances they were in is going to do that either way. It's just a matter of how they can speak on that and create that community and understand that, oh, there's other children that are going through this.
Your balloon story made me think of um just like the idea of planting seeds for kids, talking about, consent, gender-based violence, and those things. And I'm gonna use SpongeBob as an example, but so many people my age, our age, watched SpongeBob growing up. We still reference it. There are memes everywhere about SpongeBob. And when you go back and watch, there are slight like feelings of gender roles. There's a little bit of fat phobia in these things. And I think that sometimes kids shows represent a country's values. And I think that if someone was to go out and make a kid show that people liked, I mean, I think that's the hard part, that you have to make, like, SpongeBob is funny. Like, you have to make it funny, and you have to make kids want to watch it, but also have those like small inklings of like gender equity, and instead of the fat phobia, like Yola has said to me, or talked to me about this cartoon in Finland where, like, I don't, what is it called? It's
Women.
yeah, yes, Moomin, and like all these kids know exactly how to set boundaries and those kinds of things. And I think it's because they're planting these seeds in these kids shows, because it's not a heavy topic, but they're still like just throwing it in there. They're normalizing it. They're trying to set these values young, and I think that's really important. And then I also wanted to comment on the pod mapping, which was like, it was almost like a revelation. I'm sitting in this chair. I was like, wow, like that's kind of what,
Right.
like that's what we're looking for. Like that I think that we all want community, especially when we talk about gender-based violence. Like, community is such a big part, but it's like, how do you build that community and what does that look like? But I think it was important to hear that term pod mapping, being like, oh wait, like I know someone with a car, and I know someone who's a really good listener, and like I have that. I just have to define it, and I have to look for it. And I have to like be okay with being able to reach out, which is a whole nother story, like asking for help. Um and yeah, I thought pod mapping was an amazing thing. And then the final thing I wanted to say about the solutions you offered was the politics of it. I'm not a politics person. I despise politics in this country. At the same time, people do listen to politics. And we do have to, like, vote for the people that, if we can find a candidate that represents values that we're, interested in. But like, we do have to support that, and we do have to find ways to fund those kinds of things, because that's how things work in this country. So I thought those are some really good examples. I want to backtrack a little bit, and in our first episode, Yola and I talked about our own definitions of gender-based violence and how those are working definitions, and how those things are ever changing. My definition has changed since a month ago when we started. But we like to ask our guests, what do you see as gender-based violence? How do you define that? Can it be defined? And if your answer is that there's no definition, that's also okay. But we're curious, what is gender-based violence to you?
Yeah, gender-based violence to me is a really big umbrella term, right? So it's really any experiences in which someone's abusing power, privilege, and control um, over somebody else based on the gender differences amongst them. So it's really big, broad, and vague for a moment because I do think that we need definitions of gender-based violence that can speak to a wide spectrum of experiences that could be digital violence or harassment all the way to fatal acts of violence, right? So I wanted to be really, really expansive umbrella in terms of what it can refer to. And we also need definitions, I think, of gender-based violence that don't center women. I think that a lot of the conversations that we've had, importantly, came from women who were experiencing gender-based violence, and we live in that legacy, while also needing to expand our definitions to understand that anyone can abuse power, privilege, and control over someone else, right? And when you do that, you end up having a gender neutral analysis then, or a starting point for who can perpetuate and harm other people. So if we're talking about abuses of power, privilege, and control, that could be a teacher and a student, right? That could be a parent. It could be an older sibling and a younger sibling. And in that way, I think that we're able to talk about gender-based violence as more about the ways in which we can harm one another. It could be anybody, right? Because anybody could actually harm another person. It doesn't make it boogeyman. Some strange person out in the world. It could be anyone, right? So I like to think about gender-based violence in a way that's really expansive about who it could potentially be without absolving ourselves, even as people who do this work, being real and honest about the ways in which we then want to be accountable for the ways that we might perpetuate harm and violence in other relationships and spaces that we're in, as well as having a more gender neutral definition to acknowledge that people of all genders, unfortunately, can and do experience gender-based violence, as well as the spectrum. I do think that in talking about gender-based violence, it is very helpful to then, from the umbrella, talk about very specific forms of violence as well. Because sometimes we don't always have a good picture of what sexual violence is or what emotional violence is. I think sometimes we have better pictures of what maybe physical violence are without like concrete examples. So I will say this, like the umbrella term that gets at all of the things, but what I've found, especially in talking to just people day in and day out, more and more, I've found that people come to recognize their experiences as violence when they hear another survivor's story. And it starts clicking that it's like, wait a second, that happened to me too. What are you saying? And then we're able to kind of talk through it. I think similarly to what you were saying about the balloon, right? Where it's like there are ways of talking about gender-based violence that aren't just about like the definitions or even sometimes, you know, the legal definitions that are very, very limited on what counts as violence. But it's really, I think, through telling stories that people actually come to realize, like, oh, wait a second, no, it wasn't okay when that person maybe yelled at you on Monday and then gave you the silent treatment on Tuesday when you brought up that that wasn't cool that they yelled at you, right? Like you start hearing through each other's stories what gender-based violence actually is. So yeah, big umbrella term, but also I know we get more clarity when we're able to talk to each other through stories and examples.
But we
Oh no,
can't
I
hear
can't
you,
hear you.
Yola.
Sorry, I muted myself. I was gonna say that also like a part of our podcast, as you've gathered from the name, is from hurt to healing. So we also ask our participants, especially because you've been doing this work for a long time, whether having going through it like personally or professionally. And I think something that I've also noticed that comes up for me, but I think Anthony and I have also talked about this, is even when you are doing this work, regardless of how far along you are with it, like things flare up. You will be triggered, you'll be anxious, you'll be confused, and you'll realize more and more layers of what maybe you didn't realize the first time. What are some ways that you promote your own healing, or what are things that have promoted healing throughout your journey with gender-based violence?
Ooh, that's the question, isn't it? Because you're right, like healing is so non-linear, right? Like it's not like you reach a peak and then like, oh, I'm just gonna be good for here on out. So many things. I think where I want to start is on that. So like one of the things that's been really helpful to me is realizing that healing is not linear. That instead of trying to figure out how am I going to just be okay or have all good feelings all the time, instead of thinking that that's what healing means, I realized that like personally, professionally, being in community with different people, movement spaces, that if you can do more to regulate your nervous system, to expand your window of tolerance for when you're having moments of activation or triggers, you are doing the work. So, what I mean by that is there were times where someone would share their experience of gender-based violence very early on, and like me coming into this work back when I was like in high school and college. And I mean, I would just be in tears because it was really real for me. And I was like, oh, I cannot. And I would like really disengage because I was not able to really be present to actually hear and bear witness to what someone was saying because I was hurting so bad and hearing what they were saying. My window of tolerance was super small. Like it was super small. But over time, with some of the things I want to mention that have helped me, I was able to grow my window of tolerance by being able to regulate my nervous system, having fidgets, being able to like sketch and draw, being able to walk. That bilateral stimulation is so healing and important. And sometimes people say, I don't know, you probably heard of it like butterfly tapping, where you like tap on the other side of your chest, or even you can do it like on your legs. But that's helpful to come back present, right? Because in those moments of activation and trigger, we're taken out of the actual present moment to some place that we used to be in the past, or maybe we're starting to feel anxious about what could happen in the future. And whether you're in the past or in the future, you're not in the present, right? So it really has helped me so much to be like, what are things that help me regulate my nervous system to be present with what's actually happening, whether for myself or to bear witness and be present with someone else. So some of those things I just mentioned have been really helpful, but also a therapist. Like just straight up, like not all mental health professionals are equal. There's some folks who do some serious harm, but I've been fortunate enough to find some folks who were really just actually good at their jobs and cared about me as a person, and helped me learn more about what my sites of activation and triggers actually are. They were before were just kind of coming at me. It was just happening, right? And like now I know, I was like, oh, if we talk about that, I'm gonna get upset. I'm going to want to snap back and I'm gonna feel defensive because I'm like, okay, here's the example. I don't know if this is making me y'all recording, but maybe cut this part. But I feel a lot of activation when I have to do like emotional labor for elders that did not do emotional labor for me. I had to learn that about myself. So it's like, oh, you want me to care for you and be like a parent-like figure in a way that you were not to me. That doesn't work for me. So I had to learn that about myself, right? So it's like, I'm getting really hypey right now. And like my teenage self is coming out and I'm a grown woman. What's happening? That's what was happening, right? And I had to learn that in order to be like, okay, I need something right now. And what I needed in that specific example were boundaries. I was like, I can't hold space for certain elders because it takes me to a previous version of myself, my teenage self that's like upset and rebellious, and I'm not able to be present as the adult person that I am. And so things like that have really helped me. Therapy, just like actually learning more about myself and what I need. And I think also just being in community with people that genuinely are working for a different future.
Mm.
Um, so like not people on the sidelines that just talk shit on Twitter and like don't actually
Mhm.
organize or do anything. Not people who like, I don't know, are academics and also just kind of like talk about shit but don't do anything. Like genuinely being with people who are like, we want to make real differences in the world and we are championing that world and we're experimenting towards that world and showing up for each other gives me so much hope and healing because it makes me believe that a different future is possible. Um, it makes me feel less stuck and sad about the state of the world because I see what other people are doing, even if it's just like learning about the podcast that you all are doing and the work that you continue to do, even outside of the Women's Center, like that's genuinely inspiring to me because it means the work continues and you're continuing to innovate and figure out what's possible. And that has been so healing to me to just like see that people believe that something's different and are actually working towards that different world.
Hmm.
Thank you. That
I like
was
that.
that was so nice. Yeah. I just wanted to say one thing, and then Anthony can go. It was your class actually taught me so much about that I can do things in the moment to feel actively less triggered and to come back to being present, like learning about bilateral stimulation, butterfly tapping, having fidgets, not have fidgets in my apartment that anyone that comes over can just play with. And at the Women's Center, we also would use fidgets a lot. And then in my Empower sessions, I always would like to end like with a meditation, and then we would give people fidgets like in the beginning, and a lot of that was curated from your class because I took your class my sophomore year. So then it shifted a lot moving forward of, okay, these are things that were actually very helpful for me. How can I incorporate these things in the spaces that I occupy? And then it's so great to see that that's kind of the mentality that you had, because right now we were just asking, well, what helps you, and you were saying, well, these are the things that help me, and then you get to embody that in your work and portray that role model of how you can do those things. And it has impacted me and helped me and has probably helped like so many other people by knowing that they can use these things, and you don't have to just sit and be anxious. Like you can move, there are things you can do, you can literally leave. But if you can't do any of those things, you can always just like fidget around, like calm down your breathing, focus on just coming back to the present moment, whatever that looks like for you. So I thought that was really great and interesting, and I really appreciated that from your class, and to know that that's something that you just embody in general and it just translates to the work you do. Like that's just the best thing.
I appreciate your feedback and for sharing that. I'm so glad that it was helpful and that like you paid it forward to other people, because it's like we're always learning together, in these spaces. And I think it's so important too, because when we say we like want to work towards this world, like we have to practice it ourselves. Like it becomes a habit if like you actually make it a habit. And I think it's also important because we want to have choice, right? Like we don't want to replicate being silenced, having to be stuck in a situation that you have no control over. Like a lot of what's normalized in society is really traumatic. To be like,
Mhm.
oh, if you're feeling really anxious or you're feeling really activated, you're feeling really triggered, you're taken back to another moment, you just have to sit through it. Survivors hear that all the time. That's the worst. Like, no, we actually need
Yeah.
to come up with like some options for people to be like, you can physically leave if you need to. And I remember getting some feedback from some students that were like, you should not tell people that they can leave because then they just like won't come. And I was like, yeah, but I meant it when I said that. You really don't have to because you need to be empowered in your choice for what your window of tolerance is and what you need. So if you want to stay, you have resources and support to actually honor that choice to stay. And if you realize this is not it, I can't do this right now, I need something outside of this classroom, people should be empowered to do that. And I think that it's really important that we're modeling and actively practicing what it means to honor survivors' autonomy and choice, whether it's to stay engaged, leave, come back, leave for a while. I think that's so important, in the work that you're doing with Empower and other spaces.
I have a I have a specific question that, sorry, that moves into a bit of a broader question. When you first started talking about your healing, you mentioned that you had a small tolerance, and then that tolerance grew. I'm curious if you ever struggled with the balance between growing a tolerance or being desensitized to the trauma that you're listening to. Did you ever struggle with that balance? And then further, I wanted to ask, what gets in the way of your healing? Like, are there things that get in the way of your healing?
I don't even know if I can answer the second question. That's so deep.
It's okay, you don't have.
And you
I'm like,
really don't
that's.
have to. You absolutely don't have to.
I'm gonna think about it though. I'm gonna think about it. I think to your
Yeah.
first question, I have been very, very, very active in choosing not to be desensitized, which is very challenging. But one of the things that I try to do is like if I know that, so just for instance, I don't know where you all land on this, but I'm just gonna share anyways. As I watch what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine, it is absolutely heartbreaking. Like it is actually just, it feels awful to watch people be systematically starved and bombed and targeted.
Yeah.
And I realized that like constantly watching videos and looking at photos was not actually bearing witness, and it was not helping anyone for me to get to a point where I'm like I can't move because I'm frozen in sadness and anxiety. And so being able to like really think about like my social media hygiene has been really important to be like, I'm going to stay engaged and I'm going to do it in a way that's very thoughtful. That if I say, okay, I'm not going to just log on because I was doing this for a while. Like as soon as I woke up in the morning, I was like, I need to see what's going on. It's like, I have to stop doing that. Let me ground myself and then I can engage. The other thing that has helped me is like, especially working with people. I was at a professor in college who specialized in studying genocides, and she um, was telling us about Yemen. And I remember she wanted us to like watch this video, and I was like, "Oh, I'm not sure I can like watch this video without like being desensitized." Like I was like, I actually like I feel like the more that I try to like bear witness, the more it's gonna make this like normalized. And I was like, I think that I've learned enough to believe the survivors of this genocide and not have to watch more. And I don't know that that's gonna
Mhm.
help me. So sometimes I will also just say, you know what? I don't need to get more and more and more evidence to believe what survivors are telling me. And that helps me not be desensitized because I can just believe survivors when they say that like this is the experience that they're having without like overdoing it in trying to bear witness and read and watch everything that I possibly can. So I think those are some of the things that have helped is being intentional about how I like bear witness to certain experiences of violence, as well as um being able to like time out when I'm like, oh no, I believe people. I was like, this is enough for me. I don't have to um almost consume I think, you know, like traumatizing and violent imagery and stories. To be really
I've
mindful of that line as well.
I have a pretty big issue, and I don't know if this is unpopular, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but um, I get very annoyed when people post these videos of bombings, of killings, of dead people on their, I'll use Instagram stories just as an example, and they'll say, no trigger warning, like you should see this, and it's like I think that people should be educated, but I also don't think it's for you to decide whether or not I get to see a dead baby or thousands of people dying in a moment. I think it's very unfair for people to decide that for me, especially when you can't, like, there's no preface, like you decided not to put a trigger warning. And that's my little tangent. It's very frustrating because I don't think it's fair to those who are concerned about desensitization and who frankly don't feel comfortable consuming that at a moment's notice. I think it's pretty frustrating.
No, I totally want to validate your frustration because what I hear you saying is like you're concerned about being desensitized, you're concerned about what's actually going on, and and with that, that means you're concerned about um what is it that you can actually do, right? And if
Yeah.
you're desensitized, you may not be pushed to action or to movement, right? And if you're just being pushed with, images or videos, um, it doesn't necessarily come with a call to action. That action is
Yeah.
just to bear witness, right? And you may not have capacity to bear witness because you didn't have an opportunity to actually consent to be in a state to truly bear witness, right? Like it's an
Yeah.
active process. It's not just, okay, I just saw something. That is the desensitization that you're talking about. So no, I think what you're saying is really frustrating on a personal and political level because it's not fair to you as somebody who is in active movement and wants things to be different. It could be very harmful to you. And politically, it's like, okay, well, we also need a call to action. It's not enough to just bear witness on social media, right? Like, we actually do need people to stop making the bombs, to stop sending them, right? Like, there's something we
Yeah.
want to be pushed to action on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that, and I say this as someone that would do the same thing of like wake up first thing in the morning, just consume so much of it, and then I'd spend the rest of my day like in and out of anxious moments because I think when you are doing this type of work, not just in the instance where you open your phone and then that's it. It's like when you're committed to doing this work, you see it everywhere. You see it in everything. You see it in your own thoughts. You see it in how other people are thinking, what they're saying. It's like you're always on. So you have to be very intentional about when you are off because what I noticed was happening with me was in addition to always being on, also physically putting myself in that place of like, okay, opening my phone and being like, okay, post like everything you can, repost everything you can, spread that awareness, which I think is great. Like, I think it's a great tool for other people to use, and different tools work for different people. Like, that's amazing. But I did notice with myself that that was leading me to burnout, and I think it does lead a lot of people to burnout, and they don't realize because we constantly talk about this. Oh yeah, something is trending now. Everyone's going to talk about it for a week, and then after a week, everyone stops. And I think a big component of that is because everyone is focusing so much on it for a whole week. Like no intentional turning off, no taking care of yourself, no censoring like or allocating specific time when you can think about this issue versus this issue. Like you're constantly just on it that then that essentially leads you to burnout because it's triggering and it's a lot and it's a lot for your nervous system and it's even more when you physically like or just politically feel like you can't make that big of a difference. So to be able to like see that and then be even personally triggered based on your personal experiences and your identities, based on your community and support system, things like that, being constantly in that state of trigger for, let's say, a week, yeah, you're not going to want to continue posting or talking about it or just creating the space. And I think that's a big thing with gender-based violence is, yes, once you start seeing it, you'll always see it. You can't just close your eyes and pretend it's not there. But then you have to be very mindful of creating time specifically for yourself to take care of yourself and not thinking about it constantly. Otherwise, you will burn out. And we need like this is not something that we're working on today for tomorrow. Like we need people that are committed to a very long term because this is long-term change. And with long-term change, you have to be very intentional about the short-term actions that you're taking for yourself in order to continue showing up in the same way consistently and not just for a week.
I don't know how y'all do it, but I feel like that clip right there just needs to be like blasted everywhere. Like it's long term progress that we're looking for. So you have to pace yourself along the way. Yeah, I was like, burnout is so real and so common in movement work. And it's sad, right? Like it's sad for the actual person. Again, most of us come to this work because we ourselves were survivors or allies and advocates of people very close to us who have experienced some form of gender-based violence. So it's like people who have already experienced a lot are now burning out. Like that's
Mhm.
actually just really, really sad. And what a loss to the movement of their brilliance and their brightness and their magic. it's such a loss. And I do think, and part of what both of you are getting at is like, we have to be really mindful of what our strategies are, right? Because there's so many things that we could do. There's so many tactics that we could use, but we don't want to have a strategy or a lack of strategy where we're just consuming lots of things. And it doesn't actually move the needle on any of the issues, right? So we're burning out, our comrades are burning out, no material changes have happened, right? Like things are still ongoing. It's like, no, what are our strategies, both for ourselves and our community care, as well as like for actually changing things, right? So I think it's so important, generation to generation, to really be clear on what is it we're fighting for. And there's lots of things that it is a contest. What are we fighting for? We know that there are lots of curriculum bans happening across the country. We want to be mindful of what it means to really push for continuing to have Title IX education, right? I was like, that's a fight to make sure that programs like the ones that you all have facilitated, right, with Men's Project, like that continues, that there's funding for that. It's a contest of budgets, right? I think I heard not long ago that the student centers at UConn were kind of being defunded, right? Like, so these are all the things with like, no, there's like concrete things to fight for to ensure that programming and resources and support continues to exist and can expand and deepen and grow in the ways that they need to, you know?
Yeah, and thank you so much for bringing the Palestinian genocide into the conversation, into the space, because I think it's so important to create the space for that and talk about it and the relevance of gender-based violence, because it's like one of the epitomes of that I don't think it's necessarily talked about enough or as much. And I think it's great to bring even more awareness to that, and in ways that are sustainable and informative and educational. And yeah, these are things that are relevant and ongoing, and they're hard, but they're super important to be talked about. And we're happy to like have a platform that hopefully can do that in one way or in another. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good point too. And our or my last question, we don't want to take too much of your time. I'm really curious how philosophy and your study of philosophy has played into your work now, and whether or not what you learned while learning philosophy, does any of that show up in the work that you do, or just in the world in general? Do you have any takeaways?
Yes, I do actually, because it's always so curious to people and to myself even, that I pursued philosophy and that was my journey. It has been so helpful. Philosophy is this, it's a human experience. Like we all philosophize, we all ask big questions about why the world is the way that it is. Could it be different, right? Like it's just a human activity to ask questions about how do you know what you really know and all of that. But the academic fields of philosophy is an interesting discipline to get involved in. And one of the things that I really appreciate about my academic training in philosophy is that it made me such a sharp, argumentative writer and speaker. I know 10 steps forward and 10 steps back from anyone's arguments, right? So I spent so much time reading like legal cases and being like, these defense attorneys are about to lose this case because you need to beat them on this argument. Like I am really detailed at that. And I know it's because of my philosophy background that I learned that specifically. So there's that. I think the other thing that's really been helpful in my current work is that I'm able to do really good landscape analysis. So I spent a lot of time doing social and political philosophy. And so I have a deep appreciation of the way that history repeats itself and moves through time, as well as what are some different political trends that people have used over time. So I feel like I have a really good background and being able to understand where we are in history in a given moment, as well as what are some opportunities in different landscapes. So just to be more specific, for instance, this year is a major presidential election year, as we all know, right? It is also a year in which there are a lot of congressional seats up for grabs, right? And at the same time, there are a lot of local elections happening for judges, sheriffs, and all sorts of people who are now considering what it means to defund the police. People weren't using that language before. So in these moments where we're talking about campaigns and lots of people will talk to you about who to vote for, who to not vote for, okay, the American political machine is going to do what it do. There will be conversations like it's a contest, right? Anyone that wants to be the head of the US empire is not necessarily the best person, right? Like you are actually the head cop. The president is the head of the military. So just structurally, there are some issues, right? And when we're saying who's going to be on the candidate that matches our values, the job itself is incredibly violent. So it's going to do what it do. There will be opportunities to have really robust conversations, potentially, if we engage with them, with our community members, about what we actually want. So regardless of who ends up getting elected, and that will matter, we will have so much organizing and things to do, because that does matter. But regardless, we have an opportunity to talk about what safety means. We have an opportunity to talk about what does it mean that sexual violence is so normalized within the entertainment industry, for instance, right? And I know it might seem disjointed that there's a political year and people are talking about this. And on the other hand, people are talking about what's happening with Diddy, but it's not disjointed. These are all robust conversations that are all happening at the same time, where more people are paying attention and talking and are online in ways that in non-election years, people may not be having as many public conversations, and we may not have as many contests to try and push some people on what their policy stances actually are locally and, like, I think especially statewide. So I think philosophy has given me a lot to consider in terms of what are opportunities in any given political landscape for pushback, for conversation, and to develop a sense of curiosity and imagination that I think you can develop in other disciplines as well. But we tend to be kind of far out there in philosophy, and I appreciate that because I definitely imagine and dream really big in terms of what I imagine to be possible, which is the ends of colonial empires. And I can't fully credit academic philosophy for that, but I can credit the radical philosophers that I got to work with throughout my career, including people like Kyle White and Christy Dotson and Elena Ruiz. There's some, and Elisa Vieira. Like, there's so many like just dope people who find themselves asking big questions in philosophy, and that's been really helpful to me.
Great.
Look,
oh.
sorry. And this is like to wrap it up. If you look back at your journey, what is like one piece of advice or one takeaway that you would want our listeners or your younger self to take away from all your experiences so far and the work that you've done? What would be something that you would say either to our listeners or to your younger self getting into this work?
I think my one thing would be stay accountable. Not necessarily to like your ultimate career goal or the number of followers you think you need to have, but stay accountable to community. The same people that you're writing down in your pod mapping should be the same people who can call on you to show up for them, and people who can also call you in when it's necessary and there's opportunity for growth. I think that being someone who has grown through community, through accountability, has been like a North Star for me. So whether, I was a faculty member or now a senior director at a nonprofit, I keep coming back to who am I accountable to? How do I continue to build community with those people such that I never feel lost. Like I have feedback from the people I care most about, whether or not I'm showing up in community the ways that I'm supposed to. And it feels really good to be able to call on someone and go, hey, I need help, and they're there. And it feels good when someone calls me and is like, I need this, that, and the other. And I'm like, I will be there. It makes life, I think, a lot more livable and rich, regardless of title or work or whatever. because at the end of the day, like, we are people, and we're people who exist in community with each other if we're lucky. And in order to really sustain that, you have to be accountable to some people who can walk your dog or pick you up from the airport.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think when you boil community down, one of the biggest components is accountability. How can we show up for each other? How can I take, but how can I also give? And I think that's a really good point. And then one quick note before we wrap up, I wanted to tell you something I love about you, and that I think that everyone in the world should embody, and it's owning what you're good at. When I asked you about philosophy, you said, I am good at this, this, and this. I know I'm good at this, this, and this. And I think that if I were in that situation, I would say, I'm pretty good at this, knowing that like I'm probably really good at this thing. So I just really appreciated the language you use when talking about yourself. And I think, and maybe I'm overthinking it, but I think it's a reflection of the work that you've done. It's like you're giving yourself the credit for being really good at something, which can be really hard. So I just appreciated the language you used.
Thank you. And I hope y'all own what y'all have to offer too. You know what I mean? I was like, the way y'all analyze things and make connections, that is not easy. Y'all just wove like, I don't know, like 12 different topics all together. That's a skill set with concrete examples and personal experience. Like, no, own it. Because we need you to, like, sincerely. Like, in this movement, we need people who are like, no, this is what I have to offer. This is what I got. And if we each offer what we got in our different parts of the world, like, together, it makes for a much more robust movement. So own it.
Thank you. We're trying.
This was
I'm trying.
yeah. No, this was great. I really appreciated. I knew you'd be great, and I knew your voice is so important. It made such a difference, and how I've thought about the world ever since I took your class, and about my career, and about where I want to be, and how I want to show up in spaces. So I think what you have to say and what you've endured and what you've accomplished are so important, and the way that you talk about them, Anthony's right, it's like so inspiring, and I'm so grateful to have you on our podcast.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. I'm grateful to be in community with you all. Let's stay in touch, please.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
good
you.
rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care, y'all.
Bye.